A girl spent 7 years in a wooden box. 7 years of life in complete darkness. A plywood box measuring 1 meter by half a meter, slightly more than 40 centimeters high. That was the entire space she had over many years. Imagine the silence, only interrupted by the creaking of the floor and muffled voices. Sometimes, the crying of a child. Sometimes, the laughter of his parents and footsteps. Footsteps above her head. Her entire reality was reduced to this narrow space under the bed on which the family of her kidnappers slept peacefully. Without light, without connection to the outside world, only rare minutes when she was let out of this cage and brought back again. Her food was reduced to a minimum. Water was given in doses. She could not stand up, stretch her shoulders, or fully extend her legs. All the time she spent in a hunched position and felt the hard plywood with every cell of her body. And above her flowed ordinary, domestic life. Alarm clocks in the morning, breakfast and dinner, television, conversations. They lived as if she did not exist. But this was not just a nameless girl from police reports. This was Colleen Stan. And this happened to her, not in the gloomy Middle Ages, but in modern California, 1977. Exactly then, in May, she set off hitchhiking to a friend's birthday and accepted the offer to be taken by a young couple with a baby. Colleen smiled as she got into the car, because looking at them, she felt no threat. Exactly this decision brought her into this wooden box for the next 7 years. But who was this girl before her world narrowed to the size of a box? Colleen Stan was like hundreds of other girls her age in the late 70s. At 20 years old, she lived a full life in which there were friends, hobbies, and big future plans. Her family was an ordinary American family from Oregon. Warm relationships with parents, evening watching of favorite shows on television, and dreams of one day traveling far beyond the borders of her hometown. She worked as a waitress in a cafe, liked to listen to music like Eagles and Fleetwood Mac, and on the wall of her room hung posters of popular bands and movies. It seemed there was nothing in Colleen's life that could have led her to tragedy. On the 19th of May, 1977, her close friend had a birthday. The friend lived in a small California town called Westwood, about 400 miles from Colleen's home in Eugene, Oregon. The journey was not small, but for Colleen this seemed to be no problem. She had already traveled by hitchhiking to her friends several times and knew how to do it safely. At that time, this was normal. Young people traveled by hitchhiking without feeling particular danger. Colleen was not the type who gets into the first car that comes along. She looked attentively at drivers and cars, sometimes passing up several options in a row until she felt that she could really trust the person behind the wheel. This time, as usual, she positioned herself on the busy Interstate 5 that runs through all of California. Already, several cars had stopped and offered to take her, but Colleen declined each time because she felt an inner discomfort. She always trusted her intuition, so she was not in a hurry and waited until exactly the car appeared that really suited her. Around noon, the sun began to burn, and Colleen became tired from standing in the heat. She was already beginning to think that perhaps she should return and drive tomorrow, when in the distance, a blue van appeared, slowly approaching her on the road. The car looked completely ordinary, nothing suspicious. Behind the wheel was a young man, next to him a woman, and from the back seat, quiet children's voices could be heard. A family was traveling with a baby, and this immediately won Colleen's trust. When the van stopped next to her, the woman smiled politely, and the man asked where the girl was going. Colleen named the town of Westwood, and the couple exchanged cheerful glances. It turned out they were driving almost there, very close by. Everything looked perfect. Before Colleen were not strange loners, but a completely ordinary young family. The child in the back seat was playing with a toy and waved to the girl when it noticed her. This melted the last doubts. Colleen smiled back and opened the door with relief. It seemed to her she had made the right choice. At that moment, nothing indicated misfortune. On the contrary, This was the safest of all possible situations that could meet her on the road. The girl sat down in the seat, adjusted her backpack, and even felt relief that she would soon arrive at her friends. The van set in motion, and behind the windows, familiar landscapes of the California road flashed by. Colleen relaxed, listened to the radio and quiet conversations in front. She did not yet suspect that by choosing this car, she had set in motion a chain of events that would soon reduce her world to the size of a wooden box under a bed. In the blue van was a couple with a small child, seemingly a true symbol of safety on the road. What about this symbol could go wrong? At first, everything was quiet. Colleen looked out the window. Fields, hills, and rare road signs passed by. The radio played quiet hits of the 70s, and in the car reigned the atmosphere of an ordinary family trip. Cameron occasionally exchanged remarks with his wife Janice, and she, lulled by the heat and the monotonous road, was almost silent and looked straight ahead. In the back, their baby hummed quietly, occupied with a toy. Everything went as Colleen had expected, quietly and safely. But at some point she noticed that the van began to brake and turned off the Interstate 5 highway onto a quiet country road. Colleen did not pay much attention to this at first. Perhaps they just needed to make a small stop or drive somewhere on business. She looked attentively at the road ahead and expected that they would return to the main road again. But instead, the car continued on the deserted, tree-covered road and went deeper and deeper into the forest. Colleen felt the first cold shiver of fear, but tried to remain calm. She looked several times at Janice, seeking support, or at least an explanation. But the woman continued to sit motionless and look straight ahead, as if she did not notice what was happening around her. Suddenly, Cameron stopped the car in the middle of the deserted road. All around was absolute silence. Only the trees rustled and birds sang. The man opened the door and got out silently. The seconds dragged painfully slowly, and Colleen's heart was already pounding in her ears. She looked again at Janice, but she continued to look forward, as if she were frozen. Why was she not reacting? The answer came sooner than the girl could say or do anything. The door next to Colleen flew open abruptly, and in Cameron's hands appeared a knife. His gaze was cold, distant, as if he saw no living person before him. Colleen did not even manage to scream as he roughly dragged her from the car and ordered her to be silent, pressing the blade to her throat. The girl was quickly and firmly bound, without chance of resistance. On her head, they put a strange device made of wood and leather that completely blocked sight and hearing. Colleen plunged into complete darkness. The world disappeared in an instant, dissolved, and left her alone with panic and complete helplessness. The van set in motion again, but now its passenger was already a prisoner. The break with the normal world was accomplished. For Colleen Stan began a completely different life, whose existence she could not even have imagined. On the 19th of May, 1977, Colleen Stan did not arrive in Westwood. The friend to whom Colleen was traveling looked at the clock all day and checked the window, expecting to see her silhouette at the threshold. She began to worry in the evening, but tried to convince herself that she had just been delayed on the way. Hitchhiking is an unpredictable thing, especially on such a long journey. However, night came, then the morning of the next day, and Colleen did not appear. The friend's first thought was simple: one must call the police. In those years, it was not customary to panic prematurely, especially because of young people who traveled by hitchhiking. But in this case, the police reacted quite quickly because the disappearance looked strange. The girl should have arrived yesterday, but her traces were found nowhere. The police officers began by questioning residents and gas station employees along Interstate 5, on which the girl was driving south. Many on the road had seen someone who resembled Colleen. A girl with a backpack, long hair, bell-bottom jeans, and a light t-shirt. She was remembered for her smile and friendliness, but nobody could give concrete clues other than the external description. Nevertheless, several witnesses highlighted the same thing. A girl who very much resembled Colleen got into a blue van. At first, this did not look like particular evidence. In those times, thousands of such cars rolled over the roads, and young couples who traveled by hitchhiking or took other people were something completely ordinary. But soon, several coincidences appeared that made the police cling to exactly this detail. Witnesses remembered that the van was exactly blue, that the driver was a man of about 30 years, next to him sat a young woman, and in the vehicle was a baby with them. A gas station employee even noticed that the couple looked quite friendly and safe. That was a typical family, nothing suspicious, the witnesses repeated one after another. But exactly this typicality became the biggest problem. The police officers tried to identify the owners of the van, checked documents and questioned locals. But the more people they questioned, the more they understood. A blue van with a young couple and child in the vehicle was hardly less than the most common appearance on the roads of California. For every such van, dozens of owners had to be checked, but each check ended with nothing. The police officers kept returning to the starting point. They had no witnesses to the crime itself, no traces or concrete evidence that could have shown where the girl had disappeared. All that was the image smeared over hundreds of witness statements of a young family in a blue van. With each day, the chances of finding Colleen diminished, and the police officers began to understand that the investigation was hitting a wall. The first and only clue for years, a blue van with a young couple, remained the only hint about what had happened. But it gave no answers, only endless checks and dozens of false leads that led nowhere. Thus, the investigation reached a dead end and left Colleen Stan in uncertainty and isolation, far outside the reach of police and her loved ones. The description blue van with young couple proved to be too general for California in 1977. The investigation hit a wall. But if the main and only lead proved useless, who did the police then turn their attention to? The officers began to search for similar cases in the region, hoping to find at least some clue. They studied the disappearances of girls who had vanished in recent years in Northern California, especially along Interstate 5 highway. Soon, several cases were discovered that drew the investigation's attention. Girls disappeared at about the same age and under similar circumstances, but each time the police encountered a lack of concrete evidence. The investigators decided to work through all local criminals who had previously been convicted of similar attacks. They checked dozens of men who lived within a radius of 100 miles from the place where Colleen was last seen. With each, they conducted a detailed conversation, checked alibis, looked through documents and photos. But each time, the suspects could prove that they were in a completely different place on the day of the girl's disappearance. Desperation drove the police to a broader search circle. They began to check drivers who, according to witnesses, Colleen had ignored on the day of her disappearance. Who knows? Maybe one of them had harbored resentment or tracked her. One after another, the police called men for questioning. But here too, everything was fruitless. They were all simply ordinary people who helped hitchhikers and had never come into the view of law enforcement. Gradually, the investigators' enthusiasm began to wane. Each new version collapsed faster than it arose. Not one suspect, not a single serious clue. Only a pile of papers, hundreds of meaningless reports, and constant return to this blue van that was impossible to find. Time passed, and the Colleen Stan case became increasingly covered with dust. The police had to admit that the investigation had reached a final dead end. After several months without finding new clues, the decision was officially made to transfer the Colleen Stan case to the category of cold cases. The reports went into the archive, and the hope of finding her alive gradually faded with each day. But no one could imagine that she was alive all this time and so close. For the police, the Colleen Stan case became cold. For the girl herself, 7 years of horror were just beginning. While the investigators helplessly went through hundreds of identical vans and tried to find at least one trace, Colleen found herself in the house of her kidnappers, in an ordinary small town, Red Bluff, which from the outside looked like the most peaceful place in the world. The neighbors calmly mowed lawns, Children rode bicycles, and the hooker family behaved as if they differed in nothing from the others. But inside their house, everything was different. On that first day, as soon as Colleen had crossed the threshold of this dwelling, her world immediately narrowed to the size of a wooden box. This was a crude container made of plywood, somewhat larger than an ordinary suitcase. It stood directly under the bed of the hooker couple, and in it the girl was destined to spend most of each day over 7 long years. The first few days she did not even understand whether it was day or night. Her world was completely immersed in silence and darkness. Janice, Cameron's wife, initially showed practically no interest in her. She behaved as if this was simply another quirk of her husband that did not deserve her attention. Colleen initially tried to appeal to her, hoping for at least some help or compassion. But Janice turned away and walked away each time, as if she did not hear her words. Soon, Colleen even stopped trying. She spent 23 hours daily in the box and came out only for short periods to get some food or water. The connection to the outside world was completely lost, and life turned into waiting for what would happen next. And this waiting was the worst. The girl did not know what awaited her, and every sound above her head, every step or creak of the floorboards became danger signals for her. Once Cameron came down to the basement where the girl was kept, with a paper in his hands. He looked calm, almost friendly, which was particularly creepy under these circumstances. The man crouched down in front of her and explained slowly, clearly. Now, she officially belonged to a secret organization called the Company. This organization, according to him, controlled thousands of people throughout the country, and escaping from them was impossible. If Colleen even tried to leave or tell someone about her situation, the Company would find both her and her loved ones. He handed her a note. This was a contract that she had to sign to formally become his property, a slave contract. Colleen did not have the right to refuse because in her consciousness the image of an all-powerful secret organization from which one could not hide had already been created. The signature under this document became the final point of transition from her former life into the nightmarish present. On that night when she signed the contract, Colleen understood that Cameron now controlled not only her body, but also her consciousness completely. The Company, which existed only in his fantasies, became a real threat in her consciousness, a mechanism that completely deprived her of hope for rescue and made her a prisoner not only physically, but also psychologically. The captivity became not just imprisonment, but absolute control over the girl's life, transforming her into property governed by fear and despair. After some time, Colleen Stan began to come out of her narrow box, do household chores, and even communicate with guests who came to the kidnapper's house. Apparently, the girl received at least some relative freedom. Why did she not try to escape? The answer was hidden in the special system of psychological control that Cameron Hooker methodically built. Over time, he began to allow Colleen not only to come out of her narrow wooden captivity, but also to fulfill household duties, communicate with Janice, and even meet the family's guests. Of course, none of the guests suspected that the sweet and quiet girl, whom the Hookers introduced as a nanny, was actually a prisoner who had no freedom. Cameron finally and consistently hammered into the girl's consciousness the thought that each of her steps was controlled by the powerful Company. He constantly reminded Colleen that people were watching her around the clock, ready to intervene, immediately if she even hinted at saying something about her situation. The man went so far as to show her photos of her own house, her family, as if confirming that the surveillance was reality and not a product of his sick imagination. And this trick worked flawlessly. The girl did not try to escape even when she remained alone at home or went out to take out trash. The psychological barrier was stronger than all chains and locks. Colleen believed every word of Cameron's, convinced that an escape attempt would lead to the death of her loved ones. This conviction completely paralyzed her will, and the captivity continued not thanks to physical restrictions, but thanks to the masterfully created illusion of total control. From the outside, everything looked absolutely normal. The guests saw a friendly and somewhat shy girl, always ready to help. The Hookers seemed to be an ordinary family where Colleen was simply part of domestic life. No one could imagine that behind these ordinary scenes was hidden a deep psychological trap that was impossible to see with the naked eye. Thus, Colleen, although she received the physical possibility to escape, could not even seriously think about it. The control mechanism created by Cameron worked perfectly, and the only obstacle to the girl's freedom became not a locked door at all, but her own fear. At that moment, Colleen was convinced that each of her actions would inevitably lead to tragedy. This fear proved to be much stronger than any physical barrier. For 7 years, Cameron's control system functioned without disturbances. It seemed he had foreseen absolutely everything. But what single factor that he had not taken into account finally led to the complete collapse of this perfectly built prison? This factor was Janice Hooker, his own wife and accomplice, who until this moment had unquestioningly accepted all his actions. Janice silently observed for long years how Colleen gradually lost hope for freedom and became a victim not only of physical, but also psychological oppression. However, over time, a heavy feeling of guilt began to grow in Janice's soul that she could no longer ignore. The last drop that broke her unconditional loyalty to her husband was Cameron's sudden idea. He announced that he wanted to make Colleen his second wife. This thought frightened Janice and triggered a real storm of emotions in her. For her, this was no longer just a violation of moral boundaries, but direct betrayal. Exactly at that moment, she saw everything happening with different eyes. The eyes of a woman who had herself become a victim of a man with whom she had lived so many years. Gradually, the feeling of guilt and awareness of the cruelty of what was happening began to gain the upper hand. Janice could no longer remain indifferent because now it was no longer just about a strange girl, but also about herself, about her dignity and self-respect. She understood that if she did not intervene now, this nightmare would never end, neither for Colleen nor for herself. Therefore, on an August day in 1984, Janice dared to commit an act that had seemed unthinkable just recently. She went to Colleen and quietly said only one word: "Run." This was not evidence in the traditional sense, no material proof, no object that could be presented in court. But precisely this phrase became the turning point after which everything changed. Janice's words opened for Colleen the possibility to do what she had already stopped hoping for, to flee from this hell and become free again. The system of absolute control failed exactly at the moment when Cameron least expected it, and the culprit was the one from whom he expected unconditional obedience, his own wife. Colleen Stan's behavior seemed illogical. Why did she obey? Why did she not flee immediately as soon as the opportunity arose? These questions troubled not only the jurors in court, but everyone who heard this story. To understand this, the investigation had to turn to experts who could explain what happens to a person who finds themselves in such conditions. Court psychologists who worked on Colleen's case introduced several important concepts in the courtroom that helped understand her behavior. One of the most important, Stockholm Syndrome. This term emerged in the 70s after a bank robbery in Stockholm, where hostages began to sympathize with the kidnappers and defend them. Psychologists explained that under conditions of prolonged captivity and life threat, the victim unconsciously begins to identify with the kidnapper because he simultaneously becomes the source of both danger and salvation. For Colleen, exactly, Cameron was simultaneously the main tormentor and the only person who could protect her from the mythical company that supposedly could harm her relatives. Another important concept that sounded in court: learned helplessness. This is a condition where the victim, after multiple and unsuccessful attempts at resistance, loses the ability to fight, even when physical obstacles disappear. Psychologists noted that Colleen Stan was subjected to constant psychological and physical pressure. She was systematically deprived of sleep. Food was restricted. Sensory deprivation was used. Complete isolation from external stimuli, All this led to the destruction of her will and self-esteem, and formed in her the conviction of absolute powerlessness against the kidnappers. Experts gave examples. A person who finds themselves in such conditions initially tries to resist, but soon understands that all actions are useless and even dangerous. In the victim's consciousness, the thought becomes established that the only survival strategy is complete and unconditional submission. Colleen was exactly in such a state. Her external calm and obedience were not expressions of agreement, but a desperate attempt to survive and preserve at least some control over her own life. Thus, the experts came to a clear conclusion. Colleen's behavior was completely rational, considering all the horror and absurdity of the situation in which she found herself. Her silent consent was not weakness, but the only survival strategy available to her. Under conditions of constant threat, her consciousness found a way to adapt and preserve life, even if this looked illogical from the outside. Exactly these conclusions of the psychologist became the key in understanding what happened to Colleen Stan and why she behaved exactly as she did. In August 1984, Colleen Stan found herself in freedom. She could breathe fresh air with full lungs, feel that this oppressive cage no longer existed, that no one was controlling her every step anymore. But she did not go to the police. She remained silent. And this silence seemed absolutely inexplicable. If the victim herself remained silent, who decided and why to resume the case after long months of silence? Colleen did not seek help because she had panic fear of the company. She was convinced that as soon as she would turn to law enforcement agencies, her family would be destroyed and she would be captured again and returned to this box under the bed. Therefore, the girl decided simply to disappear without attracting attention. But the world she left was not ready to forget everything just as easily. Exactly, Janice, the kidnapper's wife, became the key that after some time opened the doors of the closed case. It seemed that she, after releasing Colleen, returned to the familiar world and sought to forget as if nothing had happened. But forgetting did not succeed. Janice was tormented by conscience. She was plagued by fear that the husband would one day pick up the girl's trail again. She could no longer sleep peacefully, was afraid for herself, was afraid for Colleen. Finally, Janice could not stand it and turned for help to a local priest. But the story she told sounded so wild that initially she simply was not believed. The woman claimed that her husband had kept a girl captive under the bed for 7 years. He had controlled her through an invented organization, and the prisoner had been released but never went to the police out of fear. The priest advised Janice to turn to law enforcement agencies, but there too they reacted to her story with enormous skepticism. This story seemed too incredible, too cruel to be true. However, Janice did not give up. She persisted and provided details that only a direct participant in these events could know. She described in detail the box, the house, specific details of daily life, psychological control methods that her husband had used. And gradually, the police's attitude began to change. There were too many details in her story for it to be simply fantasy or an attempt to attract attention. Finally, the police understood that the only way to verify Janice's words would be to find Colleen Stan herself and speak with her personally. The statements of Janice Hooker, the former accomplice, became the starting point of a new investigation that after years gave the case of Colleen Stan's kidnapping a second chance. For the neighbors, Cameron Hooker was an ordinary, quiet sawmill worker. Closed off, taciturn, but never showing aggression or peculiarities. But now the interrogation protocol of his wife Janice appeared in the case. What secret from the man's past did Janice reveal, thereby explaining her panic fear and desire to help Colleen? When the police began to dig in the archives, details came to light that drastically changed their idea of Hooker. Colleagues and neighbors described him as a closed-off, antisocial person who avoided any close contact and always seemed somewhat strange. But no one could believe that behind the quiet facade of this man hid such a dark past. Janice told that before Colleen appeared in Cameron's life, he had kidnapped another girl, Mary Elizabeth Spanhake. This girl had disappeared without a trace some years before Colleen's kidnapping, and this case had long since become another forgotten, cold case. Janice confessed that she knew from the beginning what had happened to Mary Elizabeth, but fear of her husband forced her to remain silent. She told how Cameron boasted to her about what he had done, and threatened that something similar could happen to her if she did not obey. Janice kept this terrible secret for years, gradually transforming from victim to accomplice. But when Cameron began to speak about making Colleen his second wife, images of Mary Elizabeth rose again in Janice's memory. She understood that one could no longer remain silent, that this was the only way to prevent the repetition of the past nightmare. Now, Janice's motive for helping Colleen received a completely new meaning. This was not just an attempt to correct old mistakes or atone for guilt. This was real fear that Colleen's fate would inevitably end as tragically as Mary Elizabeth's fate had once ended. Janice understood that the only way to stop this chain of terrible events was to tell the police everything she knew. These statements turned the whole case upside down. Hooker's past finally confirmed his capacity for cruelty and violence. What had begun as an attempt to find a missing girl now transformed into a complete investigation at the center of which stood a person capable of the most terrible acts. Now the police had not only suspicions, but concrete facts that could finally put an end to this story. During the arrest, Cameron Hooker was absolutely calm. It seemed as if he had been preparing for this moment for years and had thought up a convincing story in advance. He sat opposite the investigators and looked them calmly in the eyes, without showing a spark of nervousness. But what version of events did he have ready? And what single question from the police destroyed all his confidence? During the interrogation, Hooker spoke confidently and calmly. He categorically denied that Colleen had been his prisoner and claimed that there had been voluntary relations between them. She wanted it herself, he said calmly and measuredly. Janice was simply jealous of her and decided to take revenge. He insisted that his wife had invented everything to discredit him in the eyes of society and the police. The version sounded convincing, especially considering how confidently he spoke. However, the investigators were not quick to believe his words. They listened attentively, asked clarifying questions, and checked every word. Cameron easily answered everything that was presented to him, until one single question sounded that he obviously had not expected. "And where is the box located?" Hooker froze for a moment. For the first time, unrest flitted across his face. Until this moment, he had been certain that Janice would never reveal this secret. He could not know that the police had already been in his house and found exactly this wooden box in which he had held Colleen for long years. He could give no answer to this question. His certainty, which had just seemed unshakable, began to disappear quickly. He faltered, tried to laugh it off, but it was already too late. The investigators understood that exactly this box was the key to the truth. Now they knew that Cameron's version was collapsing, and the truth began to come to the surface, destroying the image of the calm, innocent person that he had so carefully created. In the interrogation room, 3 versions of a story sounded. Cameron confidently claimed that everything had happened voluntarily. Janice accused the man of cruelty, and Colleen told through tears of 7 years of life in a box. But words are only words. Only physical evidence cannot lie. What exactly did the police find in the Hooker's house that transformed these contradictory versions into indisputable facts? The investigators obtained a search warrant for the house of the married couple Hooker in Red Bluff. They carefully examined every corner, every closet, every centimeter of the basement room. Soon, evidence was discovered that made even the most experienced police officers uncomfortable. In the couple's room, directly under the bed, exactly this wooden box was found, a crude construction of plywood with air holes. The size and interior arrangement corresponded completely with the descriptions of Colleen and Janice. But the police did not stop here. In the basement of the house, large metal hooks were discovered that were screwed into the ceiling. Their presence proved that exactly those procedures were carried out there of which Colleen had told. These were no longer fantasies or inventions, but real, tangible testimonies of the crime. However, the most important and convincing evidence became a document found in the house, written by Cameron Hooker's own hand, that slave contract. The paper was yellowed, with notes and the girl's signature, which confirmed that she voluntarily agreed to become property of the man and the mythical company. This document transformed the words about voluntary relationships into complete nonsense and exposed the terrible reality of psychological control and manipulation. These three elements, box, hooks, and document, matched so perfectly with the statements of Colleen and Janice that even the most cynical doubts dissipated. Now the police did not need to guess who of the three people in the interrogation room was telling the truth. The physical evidence gave a clear answer by itself. Exactly this moment became the real breakthrough. Now the investigation had a perfect combination before it: the victim's testimony, the accomplice's confirmation, and indisputable material evidence. The entire defense of Cameron Hooker, which was built on his words and his certainty, collapsed in one day. Now he could only remain silent and listen as the investigators laid out the facts before him and destroyed one after another his carefully constructed lie. Even when that wooden box was brought into the courtroom, Cameron Hooker continued to stubbornly maintain his innocence. He sat before the jurors, looked at the piece of evidence as if he were seeing it for the first time, and continued to calmly claim that everything that had happened was voluntary. But if he never admitted guilt, how did the prosecution manage to expose his lie before the jurors? Throughout the entire trial, Hooker stubbornly held to his version. He and Colleen had been a couple. They were connected exclusively by a love relationship. However, everything changed when they began to call as witnesses those who could prove the opposite. First, Colleen Stan herself appeared. Without superfluous emotions, methodically and calmly she described 7 years of her life in the box. The girl reproduced every detail exactly: the size of the plywood coffin, the smell of paint, the sounds of footsteps overhead. Then that contract was presented, which completely destroyed Hooker's version about the voluntary nature of what had happened. The courtroom sank into oppressive silence as Colleen explained to the jurors why she had signed this terrible document and how fear of the invented company paralyzed her will to resist. But the decisive blow against the defense was delivered by the testimony of Janice Hooker. In exchange for immunity from criminal prosecution, she agreed to tell in detail about everything that had happened in the house. Janice confirmed Colleen's words and described in detail how exactly her husband psychologically and physically oppressed the girl. With each of her words, Cameron's version contradicted reality more and more strongly. The final defeat happened during cross-examination. Hooker's lawyer tried to find at least the smallest contradiction in the words of Colleen and Janice, but could not refute a single fact. Their stories matched completely in the smallest details that only participants in these events could know. At this moment, Hooker's lie became obvious not only to the investigation, but to everyone present. The defendant's defense was completely destroyed. Now the outcome of the case was clear and no doubts remained with the jurors. During the court proceedings, scattered facts were presented: the wooden box, the signed contract, the mystical company, the housework. But how exactly did these details fit together into a unified system? How did it become possible at all to hold a girl captive for 7 years practically without physical force? For the jurors and everyone who followed this case, the necessity became obvious to create a clear, complete, and chronological picture of what had happened. This story began quite harmlessly, with hitchhiking in May 1977, when Colleen Stan trustingly got into the blue van of a married couple with a child. However, her life changed drastically that same day. Cameron Hooker attacked her, tied her up, and brought her into a narrow wooden box under his bed. The first months were the cruelest: complete darkness, minimal food, and complete isolation from the outside world. This was a tactic aimed at complete suppression of will and creation of absolute helplessness. Then followed the second stage, psychological pressure. Exactly then appeared that legend of the Company, an invented secret organization that controlled people and could destroy Colleen's family if she tried to flee. The girl believed so strongly in this story that she did not even try to resist when they gradually began to allow her to come out of the box. The third stage came, liberation. With time, they allowed Colleen to do housework, prepare food, clean, and even sometimes to go into town with the hookers. She saw other people, could scream or ask for help, but fear of the Company completely paralyzed her will. She found herself in a strange intermediate state between freedom and captivity, where physical bonds were replaced by invisible fear. A key role was played by Janice Hooker, the kidnapper's wife. Initially, she was only a passive accomplice who silently observed everything happening. Then she became an active accomplice and helped her husband maintain the illusion of control. But finally, Janice became the savior. Her fear of the man gradually gave way to guilt, especially when Cameron decided to make Colleen his second wife. Janice could not stand it and decided to end this nightmare. The reconstruction of events finally made it possible to completely close the questions about the mechanics of the crime. Now it became clear to the jurors how one could hold a person captive for 7 years without any bars and chains. In this case, the main weapon was not physical violence at all, but the finest psychological manipulation, thanks to which the victim herself was afraid to leave, even when the doors were open. After the reconstruction of this horrible but logical chain of events, not a single question remained with the jurors about how and why Colleen Stan could live so long in captivity without attempting to escape. Now everyone had a clear understanding of exactly how the mechanism of absolute psychological control works, which held her for years in the claws of fear and helplessness. 22nd of November, 1985. The jurors withdrew for deliberation. After a week of exhausting hearings, dozens of witnesses, hundreds of pages of protocols, they finally received the opportunity to discuss everything heard among themselves. Tense silence reigned in the courtroom. The question that tormented everyone present was simple. What decision would the jurors make, and how much time would they need to reach their verdict? In the courtroom, the charges that Cameron Hooker was accused of sounded again and again. The prosecutor, addressing the jurors, clearly read each point. Kidnapping using force and threats, systematic violence using weapons, causing serious bodily harm, unlawful deprivation of liberty with cruel treatment. Each charge was accompanied by a detailed description of the committed actions and physical evidence that was presented in the courtroom. The entire trial was based on facts that could no longer be ignored or disputed by the defense. However, Hooker's lawyer tried until the last moment to convince the jurors of the voluntary character of the relationship between the defendant and the victim. But after the reconstruction of events and the appearances of witnesses, practically no chances of success remained. The jury withdrew to the deliberation room, and it seemed as if everyone in the courtroom was preparing for long hours of waiting. Usually such serious cases, especially with so many charges, require long discussions, careful consideration of each point and hours of debate. But this time the waiting proved to be unexpectedly short. Only half an hour after the door of the deliberation room had closed behind the jurors, it opened again, and the jurors returned to the courtroom. No one had expected such a quick reaction. Defense, prosecution, even the judge himself looked surprised at the people who were now determining Cameron Hooker's fate. The foreman of the jury stood up, and in the complete silence of the court, he read out his decision. On all charges, Cameron Hooker is found guilty. Those were only a few words that ended a years-long story of horror, pain, and struggle for justice. These words sounded louder than all the statements, arguments, and justifications that had been heard during the past court days. The jurors did not doubt for a minute, and their certainty became the final confirmation that justice had triumphed. Now it remained only to wait what punishment the person would receive who had been found guilty of all the crimes charged against him. The verdict put the legal conclusion to the case. But life does not end after the announcement of the court judgment, and each participant in this story had his own fate, which was impossible to predict at the moment of announcing the jury's decision. How exactly did the further life of those who stood at the center of this nightmarish drama unfold? The victim, the accomplice, and the criminal. Colleen Stan, who had survived an incredible 7 years of captivity and absolute psychological suppression, tried to put herself back together piece by piece. She underwent long therapy, changed her name, moved to another state, and gradually began to build a new life. None of her new acquaintances even suspected what she had been through. She deliberately left the past behind and did not want that nightmare to determine her further life. In time, Colleen founded a family and found the strength within herself to continue living, despite the heaviest trauma that would remain with her forever. Janice Hooker, Cameron's former wife and accomplice, used the immunity granted to her in exchange for testimony and also decided to change her life. Immediately after the end of the court proceedings, she changed her name and sought to break with the past forever. Janice did not appear in public space and chose complete anonymity, out of fear of being pursued by memories and condemnation from society. For her, just as for Colleen, a completely new life began. A life in which there was no place for old fears and old mistakes. Cameron Hooker, however, never left prison again after the verdict. Behind bars, his life gradually faded away, and he died without ever having expressed remorse or regret for what he had done. His departure provided no answer to all questions. On the contrary, with his death, one of the most horrific questions remained open. Had he had other victims? Despite all police efforts, convincing evidence for this was never found. This question remained hanging in the air and troubled those who studied Hooker's story, making them think about what other secrets he had taken to the grave. Thus, the story of Colleen Stan did not end at the moment of the court verdict, but much later. And although the legal conclusion had been reached, the emotional and psychological struggle lasted much longer than the people who sat in the courtroom that day when the verdict was announced could imagine. Everything began with one place: the abandoned railway tunnel, Galleria di Crevola. For the carabinieri who arrived at the call, this was just another object. But what they saw immediately made it clear. Something terrible had happened here. Right at the entrance to the tunnel lay a single sneaker. Nearby, an already dried bloodstain. And from it, into the darkness, went 2 furrows, as if someone had dragged something heavy across the ground. The police officers went inside. The air there was heavy, smelling of dampness and mold. The only sound, the hollow echo of drops falling from the ceiling. And the light of flashlights snatched from the darkness this terrible trail. Drops of blood that led further and further into the depths. They followed this trail, step by step, and they measured this distance, exactly 87 meters. Right there, 87 meters from the entrance, where light from the other side was already visible, they found her. On the cold concrete floor lay Ilaria, that same 14-year-old girl whose photo had been in all the local news for the 3rd day. And at this moment, the case ceased to be simply a set of evidence and distances. It became a story about a person. A story that began not in this dark tunnel at all, but in an ordinary school, among classmates. And to understand how everything led to these 87 meters of cold concrete, we need to go back several months, to that very school corridor flooded with sunlight, because it was there that the paths of 3 girls crossed, whose story brought us to this tunnel. On one side was Ilaria. She came to the class in the middle of the school year, and that's always difficult. New city, new school, not a single familiar face. She was an ordinary girl, perhaps a little quieter than the others, with a noticeable accent that immediately gave her away as a newcomer. She was simply trying to fit in, find friends, feel like she belonged, like anyone in her place. And on the other side were Sophie and Chiara. They were the stars in this class, not in a bad sense. No. They were simply those around whom everything revolved. Sophie, loud, cheerful, the life of the party, always at the center of attention. Chiara, her complete opposite. Quiet, observant. But she, as the investigation would later show, was the generator of ideas. They were like two sides of the same coin, and in their small school world, they were a force. And they had a common interest that it would seem should have brought them closer. Urbex. Simply put, they climbed through abandoned places, old villas, abandoned factories, and of course, that very tunnel. They even had their own small channel where they uploaded videos from their expeditions. This was their hobby, their passion, and they had a goal: to get into the closed chat of upperclassmen, a kind of elite club that only accepted those who could prove their coolness. And what could be cooler than night expeditions to creepy places? It would seem, here it was, the common interest. Ilaria was also passionate about photography. She was drawn to such places. But instead of becoming a point of convergence, this became a point of fracture. As often happens at this age, everything began with a trifle, with some stupid quarrel on social media over a guy whose photo Ilaria allegedly stole from stories. To this were added mockery of her accent. Word after word, offense after offense. The conflict that had been brewing beneath the surface burst out. Ilaria found herself in isolation. And Sophie and Chiara, feeling their power, decided that the newcomer needed to be taught a lesson, put in her place. And after another quarrel, they came to her with a proposal to really make peace, and together make the coolest expedition for their channel. Prove to everyone, and first of all, to the upperclassmen, that they were a team. And they chose Galleria di Crevola as the place for this reconciliation. And this reconciliation in Galleria di Crevola turned out to be not reconciliation at all. This was a test. A cruel challenge that Chiara and Sophie devised to simultaneously humiliate Ilaria and earn themselves coolness points. The plan was simple. Like everything brilliant and everything horrible, Ilaria had to spend exactly 1 hour in the tunnel, with her eyes blindfolded, so that everything would be real, so that everything would be fair. And the main question that arises when you read about this: why? Why did she agree? Probably the answer lies in that desperate desire of a 14-year-old girl to simply become one of them, stop the mockery, fit into the company, prove that she wasn't a weakling. Perhaps she believed until the last moment that this was just a stupid but harmless game, that they would laugh and everything would end. She wanted to believe them. But this was not a game. The preparation for this challenge shows that Sophie and Chiara thought everything through in advance. They came to the tunnel on their mountain bike bicycles. They had a whole kit with them. Not just a blindfold. They took an old thick scarf and a roll of black electrical tape to make a homemade mask that couldn't be easily torn off. For atmosphere and hand restraint. Plastic construction ties. And most importantly, an action camera. They attached it to Ilaria's chest. The camera was supposed to film everything: the darkness, hear her breathing, record her fear. This video was supposed to be their pass into the closed chat of upperclassmen. In the case materials, there is a recording from a surveillance camera from the nearest supermarket. An hour before going to the tunnel, Sophie buys that very electrical tape and a can of energy drink. Calmly, routinely, as if preparing for an ordinary evening. Ilaria agreed to all conditions. She allowed them to attach the camera to her and tie her eyes with this horrible mask made of scarf and tape. On the evening of May 18th, when it was already dark, The three of them stood at the entrance to the tunnel. The clock on one of the participants' fitness bracelet recorded the time. 21:05. They stepped into the darkness. This moment became the point of no return, because after it, no one saw Ilaria alive again. And when the news of the terrible discovery in the tunnel spread around the area, for Ilaria's family, 3 days of agonizing hope ended and a nightmare began. And for the Carabinieri, work began. Now this was not a case of a missing person. Now this was a murder investigation. And the first question they needed to answer was, what happened at the entrance to this dark, damp pipe? The crime scene is not just a point on a map. It's a story that needs to be read. And the investigators began this reading from the very beginning, from the access roads to the tunnel. The ground there is a mixture of old gravel, clay, and grass breaking through them. And on this soil, wet after recent rains, was imprinted what became the first chapter in this story. 3 pairs of bicycle tire tracks. Not from ordinary city bicycles, but from mountain ones, with characteristic aggressive tread. The tracks went side by side, almost parallel, and led straight to the tunnel entrance. 3 bicycles. So Ilaria was not here alone. And she didn't come here by chance. She wasn't dragged from the road. She came with someone, with 2 other people. This immediately changed everything. The version about a random maniac who had ambushed a lonely girl receded into the background. The picture became more complex. This was a group, and they came here together, purposefully. But who were they? Friends? Enemies? While one group of investigators worked with the tracks, another began a methodical, centimeter by centimeter inspection of the tunnel entrance itself. This is painstaking, almost meditative work. You look at the ground, at the walls, at every stone and every weed, looking for what shouldn't be here. A cigarette butt, a scrap of fabric, a button. Any trifle can become a key. Hour after hour passed. It seemed that apart from the bicycle tracks and that terrible trail inside, this place was sterile, empty. And when the search was already coming to an end, one of the young Carabinieri, shining a flashlight into the cracks in the old concrete wall that framed the entrance, noticed something. Something small, plastic, that had fallen between a concrete block and crumbling earth. He carefully, with tweezers, extracted the find into the light. It was a small handheld flashlight, cheap, of those sold in any supermarket. Black plastic body, Decathlon brand. The most ordinary, unremarkable thing that any tourist or local teenager could have lost. But it was here, right at the entrance. Someone could have dropped it in haste, entering the tunnel or running out of it. The flashlight was carefully packed in a sealed evidence bag and sent to the laboratory. In such cases, there is little hope. Clear fingerprints rarely remain on smooth plastic, especially if the thing had been lying outside. But this was a chance, and it was necessary to grab onto it. A day passed. Investigators questioned classmates, teachers, Ilaria's friends. Sophie and Chiara, like everyone else, expressed condolences, cried, said how good Ilaria had been. They stayed together, supported each other. They were just 2 grief-stricken friends. At least, that's how it seemed from the outside. And then a call came from the laboratory. The results on the flashlight were ready. And they were not just good. They were breakthrough. On the side surface of the body, experts were able to lift several fragmentary but absolutely clear fingerprints. And these fingerprints were not anonymous. They were run through the database, and the system gave a match. The fingerprints on the flashlight found at the tunnel entrance belonged to Chiara, the quiet, inconspicuous friend of the main class star. At this moment, the investigation got its first name. And this name turned vague guesses into a concrete direction for attack. And when the investigation got its first concrete name, when fingerprints on the flashlight pointed directly to Chiara, it seemed that the tangle was about to begin unraveling. Investigators were already preparing for interrogations to closely take on Ilaria's immediate circle. But at this very moment, when the vector of investigation seemed to be determined, a completely unexpected witness appears in the case, and his testimony temporarily leads the police down a completely different, false trail, making everyone wonder, what if everything was completely different? What if this was not teenage cruelty, but something much more terrible and mundane? The witness turned out to be an elderly farmer who lived on the outskirts, about half a kilometer from the highway where the second portal of the tunnel opened. On the night of Ilaria's disappearance, he was returning home late, and he distinctly remembered seeing a white van by the roadside. An ordinary one, without any identifying marks, of the type used for cargo transportation. The van was simply standing with its headlights off, and this seemed strange to the farmer. In this remote place, cars simply do not stop like that. He did not pay particular attention to it then, but when talk about the missing girl spread throughout the area, and then about the terrible discovery, he connected the facts and called the police. This information instantly changes priorities. Teenagers' fingerprints are one thing, but a faceless white van standing at night near the place where a body would later be found is a classic scenario that police could not ignore. The version about a kidnapper, about a maniac who could have ambushed the girls, becomes the main one again. Maybe they encountered him at the tunnel. Maybe he frightened them, and in panic they scattered, and Ilaria became his victim. Large-scale work begins. The Carabinieri pull up recordings from all cameras on nearby roads, check all transport companies operating in the region. This is titanic work. Hundreds, if not thousands, of white vans. Investigators work around the clock, viewing murky recordings, calling logistics firms. For Sofia and Chiara, this must have been a relief. The attention of the press, police, local residents, everything switched from them to the search for this phantom van. They were again simply grief-stricken friends, witnesses, not suspects. And the search yields results. After 2 days, they managed to identify that very van. They find it in the parking lot of one of the transport companies in a neighboring region. The driver, a middle-aged man, is detained right during a trip. For him, this is a shock. He has no idea what this is about. He has never been to that village and has heard nothing about any Ilaria. He swears that on that night he was in a completely different place. Words are one thing, but in a modern truck, there is something that does not lie. The tachograph. A small black box that impartially records every kilometer, every stop, every minute of movement and downtime. This is an iron alibi or a direct ticket to a cell. Experts download the data from the tachograph, and what they see puts a definitive end to the story with the white van. On the night when Ilaria entered the tunnel, this van indeed made a stop, but not by the highway near the village of Santo Spirito. The tachograph data and a receipt from a gas station with exact time showed. That evening, the driver stopped on the roadside to have a snack, but he did this 35 kilometers from the scene of the tragedy. He physically could not have been there. The false lead, which took almost 3 days of precious time, finally collapsed. But ultimately it served the investigation well. It proved that there was no random maniac in a white van. No outsider interfered in this story. And this meant only one thing. The answer needed to be sought not on the roads, but in school corridors. The investigation's attention returned again, and this time definitively, to Ilaria's closest circle, and first and foremost, to that girl whose fingerprints remained on the flashlight thrown hastily at the entrance to the dark tunnel. And so, when the story with the phantom white van finally collapsed, all attention of the investigation returned to that single solid piece of evidence they had, to the fingerprints, to the flashlight that Chiara had dropped. Now, investigators needed not simply to prove that she was at the tunnel. This was already almost a fact. They needed to understand what exactly she was doing there. And was she alone? The routine but most important part of any investigation begins, reconstructing the last hours of the victim's life and the last hours before the crime of all who could be involved. This is meticulous work collecting digital crumbs that each of us leaves behind. Requests to cellular operators to track phone movements, social media checks, and of course, collecting recordings from all surveillance cameras in the area. Absolutely all of them. From gas stations, from ATMs, from shop windows, from private houses. Dozens, hundreds of hours of video that needed to be watched in hopes of spotting a familiar face. Most of this work yields nothing. Blurry frames, random passers-by, cars. But investigators continued methodically checking every recording. And then when they reached the small family shop, Alimentari Russo, located on the outskirts of the village, luck smiled on them. This shop is a typical place where everyone knows everyone, where the owner can sell goods on credit. And its camera, installed above the entrance, was old and recorded in low resolution. But it worked. Viewing recordings from the evening of May 18th, the investigator presses pause. The time on the recording is 9:14 in the evening. The camera captured a girl riding up to the shop on a bicycle. She quickly goes inside. This is Sofia, the class leader, the life of the party, Chiara's best friend. In the recording, she looks somewhat agitated, constantly looking around. She approaches the counter, quickly pays for 2 items and almost runs out of the shop, gets on her bicycle and rides away toward the country road leading to the tunnel. This recording by itself did not yet prove anything. Well, a girl stopped by a shop. But investigators were interested in what exactly she bought. They spoke with the elderly owner, Signor Russo. He, of course, did not remember all customers from that evening, but he had an old cash register that faithfully printed receipts. Studying the cash tape, investigators found that very purchase. At 9:14 in the evening, 40 minutes before the trio entered the tunnel, Sofia bought a can of energy drink and a roll of black electrical tape. Electrical tape. That very detail that turns an ordinary purchase into key evidence. This is no longer just a coincidence. This is a direct and irrefutable fact. It was Sofia, and not someone else, who bought the electrical tape with which Ilaria's eyes were later wrapped over the scarf. This means she not only knew about the plan, she took the most direct part in its preparation. She was not a follower, she was an organizer. Now the investigation had the complete picture. Chiara left her fingerprints on the flashlight at the crime scene, and Sofia, half an hour before that, was buying one of the main tools for this test. Their story about being simply grief-stricken friends crumbled to dust. They were both there. They both planned everything. Now, this was not a question of if. This was a question of when they would confess to everything. The circle was closed. The circle was closed. Now the investigation had not just guesses, but 2 solid, irrefutable pieces of evidence that held both Sofia and Chiara in a death grip. The flashlight with fingerprints and the receipt for purchasing electrical tape. But proving that they were at the tunnel and prepared for this test is one thing. And understanding what actually happened inside is quite another. And here, digital ghosts come into play. That information which, as it seemed to the girls, they had erased forever, but which, as often happens, left its trace. When investigators, already having warrants in hand, came for Sofia's and Chiara's phones and other gadgets, they behaved as they should have according to their legend. They portrayed bewilderment, offense. Why? We are helping the investigation. We are friends. But behind this external calm, poorly concealed panic showed through. They handed over the phones. And what choice did they have? And here begins the quietest, but perhaps most intense part of the work. Digital forensic specialists connect the phones to their equipment. Their task is to extract everything: deleted files, application cache, geolocation history. And the first thing that catches their eye is emptiness. That very screaming emptiness where life should have been bubbling. The main chats in WhatsApp and Telegram, where Sophia, Chiara, and Ilaria communicated, were thoroughly cleaned out. Not just individual messages deleted. Entire conversation threads for several days before the tragedy were deleted. For any investigator, this is a huge red flag. People do not delete correspondence with a person they supposedly mourn. On the contrary, they reread it, look for some signs, last words. They delete correspondence only in one case, if it contains something that no one should ever see. This was almost a direct confession. They were trying to cover their tracks. They were hiding something. But as it turned out, they forgot about other, much less obvious witnesses, small silent spies that they themselves wore on their wrists, fitness bracelets. In our time, this is an ordinary gadget for a teenager. Steps, pulse, calories, just numbers. But in the hands of forensic experts, these numbers turned into a detailed map of that night. Data from Sophia's and Chiara's bracelets told a story that completely contradicted their words. In their testimony, they calmly parted with Ilaria at the tunnel and went home. But the data said otherwise. Around 10 o'clock in the evening, both bracelets recorded a sharp, almost vertical spike in pulse. From 100 to 110 beats per minute, which is normal for a walk, to 180 to 190. This is the pulse of a person in a state of panic or extreme physical stress. And immediately after this pulse spike followed a record of unusual physical activity. GPS trackers recorded how 2 points, Sophia and Chiara, began rapidly moving away from the tunnel. But they did not go along the road. They ran. They ran along the old railway embankment over stones and railroad ties in complete darkness. The bracelets impartially recorded the distance, 2.6 kilometers. And the time, from 11 to 13 minutes. This is not the speed of a leisurely stroll. This is the speed of panicked flight. Now the investigation had a complete picture of their behavior after they left the tunnel. They did not just leave. They ran headlong in a state of wild stress. And then, having reached home, the first thing they did was rush to their phones to destroy evidence. The attempt to cover tracks in correspondence and data from bracelets, screaming about panicked flight, came together as a single whole. They were not just there. They were running from something. And they were desperately trying to hide the truth. The truth about what really happened in those terrible minutes inside the Gallery di Crevola. And now, when the investigation had data about panicked flight and attempts to destroy correspondence, there remained the last main question. What made them run? What made their pulse jump to 190 beats per minute? What really happened in those terrible minutes inside the Gallery di Crevola? Only one silent witness could give the answer to this question. The one that was on Ilaria's chest. The action camera. This camera was the central element of their entire cruel plan. It was supposed to become their ticket to the closed chat. Their trophy. Now it became the main hope of the investigation. When Ilaria's body was found, there was no camera on her. But during a repeated, most thorough examination of the tunnel, it was finally discovered. It had fallen into a crack between the concrete floor slabs, almost completely hidden by dirt and wet garbage. The body was scratched, the lens broken. But investigators were not interested in this. They were interested in the small memory card inside. This was the moment of highest tension in the investigation headquarters. A forensic specialist in sterile gloves carefully extracted the tiny micro SD card, dried it, and inserted it into a card reader. Everyone who was in the room held their breath. A notification appeared on the computer screen. Device not recognized. Another attempt. File system corrupted. The specialist tried to run a data recovery program. The progress indicator slowly crawled across the screen and then gave an error. The card was dead. Perhaps from impact when Ilaria fell, perhaps from moisture, and perhaps it was damaged intentionally. It seemed that the last thread leading to the truth had broken. The girls could lie as much as they wanted, and no one could prove what really happened in the darkness. This was a deafening failure, but they did not account for one thing. In the 21st century, evidence is not only what you can touch with your hands. Sometimes it is just a set of zeros and ones flying through the air. While one team tried in vain to revive the dead memory card, another continued to dig into the digital depths of the seized phones. And here, in the system logs of Sophie's phone, a cybersecurity specialist notices something strange. A record of network activity dated late evening May 18th. Right after, according to data from the fitness bracelet, she ran home. The logs showed that her phone, automatically connecting to the home Wi-Fi network, initiated a communication session with cloud storage. The action camera application installed on her phone tried to synchronize the filmed material. This is a standard function. The camera films and the phone in the background slowly uploads video to the cloud to free up space and create a backup copy. Sophie, in panic, deleting chats, most likely did not even know that this process was running. She thought about correspondence, but did not think about background tasks of the operating system. The synchronization process was not completed. The logs showed that several data packets were sent, and then the connection was interrupted. Probably because the source file on the SD card was already damaged, but something still managed to get through. Having received an emergency warrant, investigators request access to Sophie's account from the company that owns the cloud service, and what they find there changes the course of the entire case. There was no video file in the main folder, but in the system cache, in the folder for temporary files that an ordinary user never sees, lay several scattered fragments. These were not video files. The synchronization program could not transmit the heavy video track, but managed to push several light pieces of audio stream to the server before the process broke with an error. These were fragments, bare audio tracks, without image. The lead investigator puts on headphones. Absolute silence hangs in the room. He presses play. First, hissing and crackling, and then a sound is heard that he had already heard many times. Guttation, the hollow, measured echo of drops falling from the ceiling in the abandoned tunnel. And over this sound, voices, quiet, frightened, breaking. The voices of 3 girls. They did not know that their main witness was not a camera, but a microphone, and it recorded everything. Truth did not die on the damaged memory card. It just waited for its time in the cloud. Truth did not die on the damaged memory card. It just waited for its time in the cloud. And now, in the complete silence of the investigator's office, it spoke. But what can a simple audio file without picture tell? It turned out that sound can be more eloquent than any video, because video shows what happened, and sound shows what they felt while it happened. These scattered audio fragments, pulled from the system cache, were the main treasure of the investigation. They were immediately sent to the audio forensics laboratory. The work ahead was surgical. First, specialists layer by layer removed noise, the hollow echo of the tunnel, the constant sound of falling drops, crackling and interference from the damaged recording. They worked for several days, and gradually from this chaos of sounds, voices began to emerge. Clean, free of interference, frighteningly alive. Investigators listened to this recording again and again, and the entire tragedy of that night unfolded before them like an audio play. Here is the beginning. Sophie and Chiara's nervous laughter is heard. They encourage Ilaria, but their voices contain not friendly support, but poorly concealed malice. Here is Ilaria's voice, quiet, frightened. She asks to remove the blindfold, says she is scared, that this is a stupid joke. In response, only mockery. And then the tone of the recording sharply changes. The sound of struggle is heard, shuffling of feet on the concrete floor. Apparently, Ilaria is trying to tear off the mask. Her voice breaks into a scream. Then a dull blow, the sound of a falling body. And immediately after this, a short cry of pain. Not loud, but muffled, full of surprise and fear. And silence. For several seconds, absolute, deafening silence reigns, broken only by the sound of dripping water. And then, almost in a whisper, in a voice trembling with horror, one of the girls utters a phrase that became key to the entire case. The voice, which experts identified as Chiara's voice, says, "What have you done?" In this whisper there was no anger or satisfaction, only pure animal horror. Parallel to the analysis of the audio recording, the work of forensic medical experts was ongoing. The autopsy results had to answer the main question: how exactly did Ilaria die? And these results perfectly fit the sound picture from the tunnel. The cause of death was massive blood loss. But it was caused not by a deep penetrating wound, as happens in intentional attacks. On Ilaria's thigh was one single cut. Shallow, superficial, but the blade passed at such an angle that it touched the femoral artery. This was a monstrous, fatal accident. Experts also determined the possible weapon. The nature of the wound, its smooth edges indicated a very sharp but short blade, such as exists in any standard multi-tool. That very thing that teenagers interested in urbex probably had with them just in case. This was not a weapon that is taken to kill. This was a tool that in panic and darkness turned into a weapon. And here, two expertises, audio and medical, converged at one point. Ilaria's death was not instantaneous. After the cut, she was alive for some time. She had a chance. If she had been given help, if the wound had been tied off, if an ambulance had been called, she could have been saved. But the audio recording does not record attempts to help. It records only panic. A scream, the sound of falling, a muffled cry of pain, and then panicked whisper and the sound of running footsteps. The experts' conclusions completely changed the view of this case. This was not a cold-blooded, planned murder. This was childish cruelty that got out of control. A quarrel in the dark, a push, an accidental wave of the blade that was supposed to just frighten, but hit a fatal point. And then, fear. Fear of blood. Fear of responsibility, which turned out to be stronger than compassion. The main question now was not who killed. The answer was obvious. The main question was why. Why did they not help? Why did they run away, leaving her to bleed out in the cold darkness of the tunnel? The main question now was not who killed. The answer was obvious. The main question was why. Why did they not help? Why did they run away, leaving her to bleed out in the cold darkness of the tunnel? Was this just animal fear? Panic of two teenagers faced with the consequences of their cruel game? Or was there something else behind their actions? Someone else? And when it seemed that all external factors had already been filtered out, a third name surfaced in the restored fragments of correspondence, which for a short time again made the investigation doubt everything. This name was Matteo. He was not their classmate. He was older, He was 17, and in their school hierarchy, he was an almost mythical figure. Matteo was a curator, the very person who held the keys to that closed chat of high school students where Sophie and Chiara so desperately wanted to get in. Studying fragments of deleted messages, forensic experts understood that the trial in the tunnel was not just their personal initiative. It was a kind of application for membership. They had to prove to Matteo that they were worthy of being in his elite club. This detail instantly changed the entire picture. Perhaps Sophie and Chiara were not organizers, but merely executors, pawns in someone else's, much more cynical game. Maybe this Matteo, using his authority, was pushing younger teenagers to dangerous and humiliating challenges. This version looked frighteningly plausible. It explained both the level of cruelty and their desperate desire to film everything on camera. They were working for a client. Investigators immediately began digging in this direction, and very soon they found what seemed to confirm their worst fears. Checking financial transactions on Sophie's mother's bank card, which she sometimes used, they discovered a small money transfer, 30 euros. The payment recipient was listed as Matteo. There it was. This was no longer just school conflicts. This was business. Business on humiliation and risk. A new main suspect appeared in the case, a cynical puppeteer who made money by manipulating other people's ambitions. Carabinieri found Matteo very quickly. But instead of a sinister manipulator, they saw an ordinary 17-year-old guy who worked after school as a delivery boy at the local pizzeria Bella Napoli. He did not deny anything. Yes, he administered the chat. Yes, he took a small fee for an invite, as he called it, to weed out random people, as he explained. But when they told him about the events in the tunnel, there was genuine horror on his face. He swore he knew nothing about any trial. He did not give them any tasks. He simply promised to add them to the chat if they did something cool. What exactly? He did not care. Words during interrogation cannot be trusted. Verification was needed, and investigators went to the pizzeria. The owner, a full Sicilian named Enzo, confirmed. On the evening when the tragedy occurred, Matteo was on shift. From 6 in the evening until 11. He's a good guy, hardworking, Enzo added. But even this was not enough. Investigators demanded recordings from security cameras installed in the hall and kitchen. And here it was, irrefutable truth. The recording clearly showed how Matteo performed his work throughout the entire evening. Here he was rolling dough. Here he was putting pizza in the oven. Here he was taking an order at the counter, laughing with colleagues. Cameras captured him dozens of times. And the electronic cash system confirmed. His personal code was used to close checks at 2100 hours, at 21:30, at 22:15. He physically could not be at the tunnel. His alibi was ironclad. The last question remained, the transfer of 30 euros. Checking the transaction date put a fat period in this case. The payment was made a week before the tragedy. It was simply a fee for entry, not for a specific task. And this second false lead completely collapsed. There was no sinister puppeteer Matteo, just as there was no maniac in a white van. All outsiders were excluded. The circle narrowed to the limit. In this story, there were no adult manipulators. There were no secret organizers. Everything turned out to be simpler and therefore even more frightening. There were only 3 girls and a dark, cold tunnel, and everything that happened there was only their doing. Everything turned out to be simpler and therefore even more frightening. There were only 3 girls and a dark, cold tunnel, and everything that happened there was only their doing. When police excluded all outsiders, when all false leads led to dead ends, the investigation of physical evidence essentially ended. But its most difficult part began. An attempt to look into the heads of two 14-year-old girls to answer that very main question: why? And the answer to it lay not in evidence, but in their digital life, in likes, comments, and deleted messages, which, like ghosts, stored within themselves the motives, fears, and grievances that led to tragedy. Psychologists working on this case began by immersing themselves in their world. In a world that today, for many teenagers, is more real than reality itself, in their social networks. And the profiles of Sophie and Chiara were like two different poles that were attracted to create destructive force. Sophie's profile was a facade. Bright, glossy, perfectly constructed. Hundreds of photos. Here she was with friends on the beach. Here she was laughing in a cafe. Here she was taking a selfie against a sunset. Each post collected dozens, sometimes hundreds of likes. She was an influencer on the scale of her school, and she lived for this. Psychologists, analyzing her behavior, noted an almost pathological dependence on this digital approval. Her mood directly depended on the number of hearts under a new photo. She constantly generated content, organized live streams, responded to comments. She did not just live, she broadcast her life. And this broadcast was more important than life itself. And the appearance of Ilaria in the class became a threat to this perfect world. Not direct, not obvious. But Ilaria was new. She was different. She aroused interest. Attention that previously belonged entirely to Sophie began to scatter. And for a person whose self-esteem was built on this attention, this was tantamount to catastrophe. The plan to teach Ilaria a lesson from the point of view of this psychology was not just an act of revenge for a petty quarrel. It was a desperate attempt to regain status, to create such content, such exclusivity, that would blow up their little community and make her the #1 star again. The video with Ilaria's humiliation and fear was supposed to be her triumph, and now Chiara. Her profile was the complete opposite. A closed account, minimal personal photos, mainly reposts of some melancholic quotes, dark art, songs by depressive indie groups. She was a shadow, an observer. But, as often happens, it is precisely in the shadow that the most dangerous ideas are born. If Sophie was the facade, then Chiara was the grey cardinal, the brain of the operation. Analysis of recovered correspondences showed that it was precisely Chiara who was the generator of the tunnel idea. It was she who fed Sophie details, heated up her anger at Ilaria. Look, she liked his photo again. Did you hear how she laughed at your joke? She acted like a skilled manipulator, playing on the complexes and fears of her best friend. Psychologists suggested that behind this lay deeply hidden jealousy. Jealousy of Sophie's popularity. Chiara was smarter, more cunning, but she lacked the charisma of a leader, and she found a way to control the leader from the shadows. Ilaria's tragedy was for her a way to prove her superiority. Not obvious, but secret. She created a scenario in which Sophie was the main actress, but she was the director. And the cruelty of this scenario: tape, complete darkness, restraining hands. This was the handwriting of her quiet, hidden anger. Neither of them would probably have gone for this alone. Sophie was too concerned with her public image to openly plan such cruelty. Chiara was too cowardly to act without cover. But together they created a perfect storm. Sophie needed a bright, shocking idea. Chiara provided it. Chiara needed an executor capable of realizing her dark fantasies. Sophie was perfect for this role. They fed each other. The group pressure that they themselves exerted removed all internal breaks. It was precisely such a psychological portrait that formed the basis of the accusation. This was a crime born not from direct intent to kill, but from a toxic mixture of teenage complexes multiplied by the ruthless logic of social networks where attention is currency and human humiliation is just content. And when Carabinieri presented them both with the audio recording from the tunnel, this house of cards of lies and denial collapsed. They heard their voices, their fear, their shame, and they broke. Both. They began giving confessional testimony, getting confused, shifting blame to each other, but ultimately restoring the entire picture of that night. A picture that was to be evaluated not by investigators, but by the court. And so, when Carabinieri presented them both with the audio recording from the tunnel, this house of cards of lies and denial collapsed. They heard their voices, their fear, their shame, and they broke. Both. They began giving confessional testimony, getting confused, shifting blame to each other, but ultimately restoring the entire picture of that night. A picture that was to be evaluated not by investigators, but by the court. But before this confession, there was silence. Several hours of tense, icy silence in two different interrogation rooms. In one sat Sophie, next to her lawyer and pale, frightened parents. In the other, Chiara, also with a lawyer and mother who silently fingered a handkerchief in her hands. The girls were deliberately separated. This is standard tactics. When suspects cannot coordinate, their stories begin to diverge. They both held to the same pre-rehearsed version. Yes, they were at the tunnel. Yes, it was their stupid idea with the trial. But they did not touch anyone. Ilaria got scared herself. At some point, she simply tore off the blindfold, screamed that we were all crazy, and ran away. Where? They did not know. It was dark. They also got scared and ran home. That was it. This was their wall. They repeated this story again and again, not changing a single word, looking the investigator straight in the eyes. They were confident in their legend. The interrogation was conducted by an experienced investigator, a man of about 50 years, who had seen everything in his career. He did not pressure. He did not shout. He spoke quietly, almost paternally. And precisely this calmness was most frightening. He began with something simple. He placed a printout of a photograph on the table in front of Sophie. 3 pairs of bicycle tire tracks at the entrance to the tunnel. You came there as 3, on bicycles. Is that so? Sophie nodded. This did not contradict their story. Then the investigator turned to Chiara. In the neighboring room, she was being shown the same thing. And then a small black flashlight in an evidence bag was placed on the table. Chiara, we found this flashlight at the entrance. Experts discovered your fingerprints on it. Can you explain this? Chiara froze for a second, but the answer was ready. I lost it long ago. Probably a month ago. I don't know how it ended up there. Maybe someone found it and brought it. Too smooth. Too rehearsed. The investigator nodded, as if accepting her version, and returned to Sophie. A cash receipt was placed on the table. Sophie, at 9:14 p.m. on the day of the tragedy, you were in Signor Russo's shop. You bought an energy drink and this roll of electrical tape. We have the camera recording. Why did you need electrical tape half an hour before going to the tunnel? Sophie bit her lip. The handle on my bicycle handlebars was loose. I wanted to wrap it so it wouldn't slip. And did you wrap it? No, I forgot later. The lies were becoming increasingly clumsy. The adult woman, the investigator for juvenile cases, sitting in the corner, sighed heavily. Another pause. The investigator took out the next printout, charts from fitness bracelets, 2 sharp pulse peaks, almost to 190 beats per minute, and a route map, 2.6 kilometers running along the railway embankment. You say you were simply frightened and went home. But this data says otherwise. It speaks of panicked flight. You ran as if the devil himself was chasing you. What were you running from, Sophie? From the darkness? Or from what you left in that tunnel? Here Sophie showed weakness for the first time. Her eyes darted about. We were very frightened. There were some sounds there. It seemed to us that someone was there. In the neighboring room, Chiara was saying the same thing. Their versions still matched. And then the investigator struck the next blow. You deleted all correspondence with Ilaria. All chats. A few days before her death. Why? If she was your friend, and you were worried about her, why erase the last memories of her? Silence hung in the room. The lawyers fidgeted in their chairs. This was a very strong move. The girls had no prepared answer for this question. We didn't want our parents to read. There was personal stuff. Chiara stammered. The wall showed its first serious crack. The investigator saw that they were on the edge. He remained silent, letting the silence do its work. And then he said, looking directly into the eyes first of one, then the other. Good. I almost believe you. Maybe you really were just frightened. Maybe we are wrong about everything. But we have another witness. A witness who was with you there, in the darkness. He cannot lie, and he will tell us everything. He took out a laptop and large studio headphones. He put them on Sophie's head. In the neighboring room, they did the same to her partner. The lawyers protested, but the investigator stopped them with a gesture. She will just listen. He pressed the play button, and that very sound burst into Sophie's ears. The echoing reverberation of the tunnel, the noise of dripping, and then their own voices, their laughter, Ilaria's frightened voice, the sound of struggle, a dull blow, a short cry full of pain and surprise. Sophie's face changed with each second. It became white as paper. Her eyes widened with horror. She looked at the investigator but did not see him. She saw that night. And then after several seconds of silence on the recording, a whisper was heard. Quiet, trembling but absolutely distinct. Chiara's voice. What have you done? At this moment, Sophie tore off the headphones. Her face contorted. She began to shake, and a soundless scream broke from her chest, which turned into loud, desperate sobbing. The wall collapsed. It crumbled to dust. According to the interrogation protocol, her first words through tears were, I didn't want to. I didn't want to. It was her. It was all Chiara's idea. In the neighboring room, Chiara, hearing her own whisper on the recording, simply froze, staring at one point. And then quietly, almost soundlessly said, I will tell. I will tell everything. The confrontation was over. The confrontation was over. The wall of silence collapsed under the weight of irrefutable evidence. Their own voices recorded in the darkness. But a confession extracted in a state of shock and fear is one thing. For court, this is not enough. The defense can always claim that pressure was put on the girls, that they incriminated themselves in panic. Therefore, while Sophie and Chiara gave their confused, contradictory testimony, other silent witnesses continued to work in the cold tunnel. Forensic experts. And their conclusions were supposed to turn the audio recording from just evidence into irrefutable proof, cementing the picture of the crime. The main task of the forensic examination was to reconstruct the events that occurred after that fateful cry was heard. In their first confessions, the girls claimed that they were simply frightened and ran away, leaving Ilaria where she fell. But that very trail of blood, stretching 87 meters to the second exit, spoke of something else. And the experts had to prove this with mathematical precision. They returned to the tunnel and began to study the floor literally millimeter by millimeter. This was incredibly painstaking work. They photographed every trace, every print, every drop, creating the most detailed three-dimensional model of this entire path. And this model told them a story that could not be hidden by either darkness or panic. The shoe tracks of Sophie and Chiara, which they left on the dusty concrete floor, were not simply chaotic prints of running people. They were rhythmic. 2 steps, then 2 more. And between them, that very groove left by Ilaria's body. But the most important thing the experts discovered were arc-shaped traces. Small semicircles that the shoes left on the floor when the girls obviously stopped to grab their burden more comfortably and turned in place. This was choreography of horror frozen in dust. They were not simply running, they were dragging. Analysis of blood drops on the floor and on the tunnel walls confirmed this version. The splashes were low, no higher than half a meter from the floor. This meant that the source of bleeding was very close to the ground. And the character of smears on the concrete walls showed that the body hit them several times when the girls tried to squeeze forward. They were not carrying her in their arms. They were dragging her behind them like a sack, desperately trying to reach the light, the exit. And here it is, the final chord of the investigation. The forensic experts took the GPS tracker data from the fitness bracelets, which recorded the girls' panicked run. They took the 3-dimensional model of traces left on the tunnel floor, and they overlaid one on the other. 2 stories, one written in dust and blood, the other recorded in bits and bytes, matched with precision to the centimeter. Those 87 meters that they ran, they did not run alone. They dragged dying Ilaria with them. This conclusion of the experts completely destroyed the last line of defense that the lawyers could still have grasped. They could no longer claim that the girls simply left Ilaria in panic. Number. They made a conscious decision, a decision not to call for help, a decision not to try to stop the bleeding. Instead, they decided to hide what they had done. They dragged her body to the other exit, closer to the road, in the faint hope that someone would find her. They tried to get rid of the body like evidence. And this simple action, moving the body 87 meters, in the eyes of the law changed everything. This was no longer simply a tragic accident. This was abandonment in danger, resulting in death, and concealment of traces of the crime. The investigation was complete. The trial lay ahead. The investigation was complete. But before the case went to court, it was necessary to fix what happened on paper, to fix it in the words of the participants themselves. And when the investigators, already having all the evidence in hand, sat opposite Sophie and Chiara again, they no longer tried to lie. They began to speak. From the protocol of Sophie's interrogation, she started screaming. That it wasn't funny, that she was scared. She tore off that blindfold. Her eyes were mad. She pushed Chiara, who fell. I didn't know what to do. She threw herself at me. Here it is, the moment when their cruel game turned into tragedy. According to their testimony, which, getting confused and contradicting each other, generally painted the same picture, everything happened in a matter of seconds. When Ilaria tore off the mask, she was furious. Pushing began in almost complete darkness. Ilaria, trying to break free, pushed Chiara, who, slipping on the wet floor, fell and hit the concrete. At this moment, according to Sophia, she became frightened that Ilaria would now run away and tell everyone everything. She pulled out a multi-tool from her pocket, not to strike, just to frighten. I just wanted her to stop, she insisted during interrogation. She stepped forward, holding out her hand with the multi-tool clutched in it, with the blade already open. In the darkness, she miscalculated the distance. Ilaria, in turn, took a step toward her. A short, almost accidental contact occurred. At first, they did not even understand what had happened. Ilaria cried out and recoiled, and then they saw blood. A dark stain was quickly spreading on her jeans, and here, real animal panic overwhelmed them. They admitted that at first they even tried to help. Sophia took off her belt and tried to tie it around her leg above the wound, but from fear her hands were shaking. She could not tighten the buckle. Blood continued to flow, and fear proved stronger than everything, stronger than compassion, stronger than common sense. They dropped everything and ran. They ran out of the tunnel, arguing and shouting at each other. "It's your fault. No, it's yours." For some time they just stood outside not knowing what to do. And then when the first wave of panic subsided, they decided to return. They hoped that everything was not so terrible, that she was just sitting there, crying. But when they returned, Ilaria was no longer moving. At this moment, they made the last, most terrible decision. They realized that if she was found here, inside, then everyone would understand what had happened. And they decided to drag her to another exit, closer to the road, in the hope that it would look as if she herself had tried to get out and simply had not made it. This was a complete, final confession. Now the court had not only a mountain of evidence, but also two confessions. It remained only to decide how to qualify this mixture of childish cruelty, fear, and stupidity. It remained only to decide how to qualify this mixture of childish cruelty, fear, and stupidity. But for the court to be able to do this, it needed a complete, minute-by-minute picture of what had happened. And the investigators, having gathered together all the evidence, digital and physical, as well as confessional testimony, were able to reconstruct the chronology of that night with frightening accuracy. 9:32 in the evening. 3 bicycles stop at the dark entrance to the Galleria di Crevola. Sophia and Chiara attach an action camera to Ilaria's chest and blindfold her with a tight mask made of scarf and electrical tape. They enter the tunnel. The countdown to tragedy has begun, approximately from 9:32 to 9:45 in the evening, the first 15 minutes inside. Judging by fragments of audio recording, this time was filled with nervous laughter, mockery, and Ilaria's attempts to understand what was happening. They lead her deep into the tunnel, deliberately taking her to its darkest and dampest parts, approximately 9:47 in the evening. Point of no return. Ilaria, driven to despair, tears off the mask. A quarrel begins, which quickly escalates into a scuffle. Chiara falls. Sophia, defending herself or attacking, this could no longer be established precisely, takes out the multi-tool. A short contact occurs, and the blade hits Ilaria's thigh. From 9:48 to 9:55 in the evening. Panic. The girls see blood. They are seized with horror. They make a clumsy attempt to help, but fear paralyzes them. They abandon the wounded Ilaria and run to the exit. Data from fitness bracelets record a sharp spike in pulse and the beginning of panic flight. Approximately from 9:55 to 10:10 in the evening. Argument at the entrance. Having run out of the tunnel, Sophia and Chiara, according to their testimony, begin to argue furiously, shifting blame onto each other. They do not know what to do. Run home and remain silent, or return and help. Approximately 10:10 in the evening. Return. Fear of consequences outweighs, and they decide to return. They go back into the tunnel and find Ilaria unconscious. From 10:10 to 10:30 in the evening. Concealing traces. Realizing that Ilaria is not breathing, they decide to drag her body to another exit. The same 87-meter journey begins. Trace evidence examination confirms that they stopped several times to rest. Approximately 10:30 in the evening. They drag the body to the second portal and leave it there. Then they collect their bicycles, which they left at the first entrance, hide them in nearby bushes, and return home on foot, trying not to attract attention. The picture was reconstructed. Every step, every action, every minute of that terrible evening was documented and confirmed by evidence. For the investigation, the work was finished. Now it was the court's turn. The trial took place behind closed doors. No press, no outsiders, only the judge, prosecutor, lawyers, parents, and two girls who had transformed from class leaders and grey cardinals into defendants. The main question facing the court was not whether they were guilty. Their guilt was obvious and proven. The question was in qualification. Was this premeditated murder, planned and cold-blooded? Or was this a tragic accident resulting from criminal stupidity and cruelty? The prosecutor insisted that the intention to intimidate using dangerous objects and in dangerous conditions was itself a serious crime. The defense, in turn, pressed on the fact that the girls had no direct intent to take Ilaria's life. They referred to their age, to panic, to the fact that this was merely a game that had gotten out of control. The court carefully studied all materials: testimony, evidence, psychological portraits, and especially the roles of each participant. Sophia, the executor, led by desire for fame and fear of losing status. Chiara, the quiet organizer, the brain of the operation, whose hidden jealousy and anger became the catalyst for tragedy. And so, after several days of hearings, the court delivered its verdict. The actions of Sophia and Chiara were qualified not as premeditated murder, but as involuntary manslaughter committed under aggravating circumstances by a group of persons with the use of violent actions. The court recognized that their initial goal was intimidation, not murder. But this did not absolve them of responsibility for the fact that their actions led to a person's death, and for the fact that they left him without help. The sentence was announced in complete silence. Sophia, as the executor, whose actions were largely dictated by the desire to assert herself, received up to 3 years in a special educational institution with a mandatory psychological rehabilitation program. For Chiara, whose role as organizer and instigator was recognized by the court as key, the sentence was stricter. Up to 5 years in an institution of stricter regime. This story left behind not only the broken lives of 3 families, it left a difficult question to which there is no simple answer. Where does childish mischief end and adult responsibility begin? And at what price is measured the pursuit of likes in a world where virtual popularity sometimes becomes more important than real human life? After the trial, life in the small coastal village of Santo Spirito was never the same again. The entrance to the Galleria di Crevola tunnel was welded shut with thick steel sheets. Now this is not just an abandoned place. This is a scar on the body of the village, a pilgrimage site for journalists and lovers of dark tourism, a place that constantly reminds of what happened.